At first, the Summers family appeared to be the embodiment of perfection. They lived in a spacious home on a quiet suburban street, a house with neatly trimmed lawns, a white picket fence, and a driveway that was always spotless. Mark and Lisa Summers were the kind of parents everyone admired, always friendly, always smiling. Their 2 children, Sophie and her older brother Ben, were well-behaved and seemed to have everything they could ever want. To the neighbors, they were the perfect family, and there was no reason to believe otherwise. Sophie, the youngest, was a 7-year-old with bright blue eyes and golden hair that shone in the sun. She had always been a cheerful and energetic child, full of laughter and curiosity. But lately her demeanor had changed. It was subtle at first. She began avoiding her friends after school, often asking to stay at their houses longer than necessary. When she was home, she would retreat into the corner of her room, playing alone or staring blankly at the wall. Her teachers noticed the difference too. Sophie, who used to be an outgoing student, became distant. She no longer raised her hand in class or smiled at her classmates. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over her. There were also signs that couldn't be ignored. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Clark, noticed bruises on Sophie's arms during a routine interaction. At first, Sophie had claimed she had fallen while playing outside, but the marks seemed to be in places where a fall wouldn't leave a bruise around her wrists and neck. They were dark purple and unmistakably the result of something much more sinister. Mrs. Clark, concerned but unsure of what to do, gently asked Sophie how she had gotten them. Sophie hesitated, looking nervously over her shoulder, then simply whispered, "I tripped on the stairs," but something in her voice told Mrs. Clark that this wasn't the whole story. Still, she wasn't ready to make accusations without solid proof. Over the next few weeks, Sophie's behavior became more erratic. She stopped eating her lunch at school and would often sit in the nurse's office, complaining of stomach aches. She began to withdraw from her friends, no longer showing interest in the activities that once brought her joy. Sophie's teachers had seen enough to know that something was terribly wrong, but there was no concrete evidence of abuse. Still, the signs were impossible to ignore. The Summers family, for all their outward appearance of happiness, were hiding a deep, unsettling secret. When neighbors or friends would visit, they always put on their best faces. Mark was an affable man, always quick with a joke and a smile, and Lisa was the picture of grace, always looking put together and kind. No one could have suspected that behind closed doors, the very people who should have been Sophie's protectors were the ones causing her the most harm. Sophie, a sweet and trusting little girl, was caught in a nightmare of violence and fear. She had no voice to speak out, no one to turn to for help. The more she tried to withdraw from the world, the more the abuse escalated. Sophie's fear of going home grew so strong that, without fully understanding why, she began pleading with her friends to let her stay with them. When asked why she was so afraid of going home, Sophie could only manage a simple "I'm just not feeling well." The truth was, she was terrified. For a time, no one outside the family knew what was happening behind the walls of the Summers home. The perfect family facade remained intact, while Sophie's silent suffering continued unnoticed, hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit. It wasn't until much later that the truth would come to light, and when it did, it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. After weeks of observing Sophie's odd behavior, her teacher, Mrs. Clark, could no longer ignore the mounting concerns. The bruises on Sophie's arms had been more than once, and her increasingly withdrawn demeanor had become harder to dismiss as just a phase. Mrs. Clark's growing worry led her to make the difficult decision to reach out for help. She contacted Child Protective Services and, upon the recommendation of a fellow teacher, also reached out to the local police. Detective Harlow, a veteran investigator with years of experience in handling sensitive cases, was assigned to look into the situation. Initially, the Summers family appeared to be cooperative and eager to clear up any misunderstandings. When Detective Harlow met Mark and Lisa, they greeted him with warm smiles, inviting him into their home without hesitation. Mark, in particular, seemed eager to portray himself as the caring father, offering coffee and assuring the detective that their daughter was simply going through a rough patch. Lisa, a poised and soft-spoken woman, maintained a calm demeanor, and assured Harlow that Sophie was just a quiet child who sometimes struggled to fit in. The home was immaculate, the kind of home that spoke of a family living the American dream. There were family photos on every wall, a neatly organized living room, and Sophie's room was decorated with care, filled with stuffed animals and bright colors. It was the ideal setup, and it made Detective Harlow's task that much harder. How could someone with such a seemingly perfect family life be hiding something so dark? As the investigation continued, Detective Harlow spoke with Sophie's teachers, neighbors, and even some of the parents of Sophie's friends. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, though it was hard to see the full picture just yet. Neighbors spoke about how they had occasionally noticed tension between Mark and Sophie. One neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, recalled an argument one afternoon between the father and daughter, though it was brief and nothing out of the ordinary. She had seen Mark raise his voice but had assumed it was simply typical parental discipline. Another neighbor, Mr. Clark, recalled seeing Sophie standing alone in the yard, her face drawn with fear whenever Mark was near. Detective Harlow dug deeper into the Summers family's background, hoping to uncover anything that might explain Sophie's behavior. That's when he stumbled upon something unsettling. There had been an incident years ago, a report of a minor injury Sophie had suffered when she was younger, one that had been ruled as an accident. But it struck Harlow as odd that the parents had been so quick to dismiss the injury as nothing more than clumsiness. Why was there no further investigation? Was this a pattern they had covered up, or was it just an isolated incident? Then there were the inconsistencies in Sophie's story. When questioned more deeply, she would occasionally mention strange things that didn't quite add up. Sophie would whisper about a game that she and her parents played, but whenever anyone pressed for details, she would go quiet, visibly trembling. Her teacher had once overheard Sophie say that she hated going home, but when asked why, she had simply shrugged and changed the subject. Detective Harlow's instincts told him that there was something terribly wrong, but it was impossible to prove without more concrete evidence. He knew he needed to gain Sophie's trust, something that would be no easy feat. He returned to the school, quietly observing Sophie and trying to find an opening. But each time he tried to speak with her, she would retreat into herself, fearful that her world would collapse if she spoke out. In the weeks that followed, Harlow spent countless hours reviewing past cases of child abuse, trying to recognize patterns, looking for clues that could lead him to the truth. But it wasn't until Sophie's behavior escalated further she began to refuse going home altogether that the detective realized the urgency of the situation. The case was no longer just about a troubled child. It was about a little girl who was living in fear, and time was running out. The breakthrough in the investigation came in a way that no one could have predicted. After weeks of tension and mounting concerns, Detective Harlow decided to dig deeper into the Summers household. He was convinced that something was happening inside those walls, but without any clear evidence or a confession. He had to be careful in his next steps. Harlow requested a search warrant for the Summers home, a request that was granted after careful consideration by the court. The team moved swiftly, hoping that whatever lay inside would be enough to uncover the truth. As the search began, the house appeared even more immaculate than before. The rooms were organized, the floors polished, and there were no signs of a struggle or any obvious evidence of abuse. Yet something about the house felt wrong, too perfect, almost as if it were a stage set for a lie. Detective Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, as though the walls themselves were hiding something. That's when he stumbled upon something unexpected. Behind a large framed photograph of the family in the living room, a small, inconspicuous hole was discovered in the wall. When Detective Harlow pulled the picture aside, he found a small hidden compartment. Inside there was an old, dust-covered camera. The camera had been placed there for a reason, its position carefully hidden from view. Harlow's heart raced as he realized that this was no ordinary camera. This was a hidden surveillance camera, one that had been set up to monitor the activities of the family. But why would the Summers need such a thing? It was an unusual find, and yet it made perfect sense in the context of the investigation. Harlow was careful not to touch anything before securing it for analysis. He quickly called for backup and took the camera to be examined. The team reviewed the footage, and what they found was nothing short of horrifying. The recordings revealed moments that no child should ever experience. The camera had been recording in Sophie's bedroom for weeks, capturing the abuse that had been taking place behind closed doors. The footage showed Mark Summers lashing out at Sophie with frightening regularity. There were moments where he would slap her across the face for minor infractions, pinning her against the wall with his hands around her throat. Sophie was visibly terrified, cowering in fear whenever her father raised his voice. But perhaps even more disturbing than the violence was the emotional manipulation that played out on screen. Mark would belittle Sophie, calling her weak, useless, and a disappointment. His words were venomous, tearing away at the child's sense of self-worth with each passing moment. But it wasn't just Mark. Lisa, Sophie's mother, was equally complicit. She was seen on several occasions in the videos, either standing by and watching as her husband tortured their daughter, or even worse, encouraging it. Lisa would laugh as Sophie cried, telling her that she needed to learn discipline and that she was nothing without her father's guidance. It was chilling to witness, as if the abuse was a form of twisted training for Sophie, breaking her down piece by piece. As the footage continued, it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. The abuse had been going on for months, perhaps even longer. There were moments where Sophie would try to protect herself, but each time the punishment became more severe. The hidden camera had captured the worst of it: every slap, every insult, every moment of terror. And yet, Sophie had never once spoken out about what was happening. She had no voice, no way to escape the nightmare she was trapped in. Detective Harlow watched the footage in disbelief, his stomach turning at the thought that such cruelty could exist within a family. But this was the proof he needed. The Summers had been hiding their darkest secret all along. The detective immediately took action, preparing to arrest Mark and Lisa Summers for child abuse. But there was still a sense of urgency in the air. Sophie was still in the house, still in danger. The investigation was far from over, and Harlow knew that getting her to safety was his top priority. The horror of the footage was beyond anything he had ever encountered in his career. But it also marked the beginning of the end of Sophie's nightmare. With the evidence now in hand, Detective Harlow knew that he could bring the Summers family to justice. The only question left was whether Sophie would ever be able to heal from the trauma she had endured, and if she would ever find the courage to speak the truth about what had happened to her. Just when Detective Harlow thought he was on the verge of bringing justice to Sophie, a new development took everyone by surprise. Lisa Summers, the mother who had played such a significant role in her daughter's suffering, was found dead in what appeared to be a suicide. The news sent shockwaves through the investigation, throwing everything into chaos. Lisa had been taken into custody earlier that day for questioning, but she had never been officially arrested. She had been calm and collected during her interactions with authorities, giving no indication that she was on the verge of something drastic. Her body was discovered in the family's garage, slumped over in the driver's seat of her car, the engine running, and a handwritten note left on the passenger seat. The note was short but cryptic, its contents more unsettling than anything Harlow had expected. It read, "I couldn't do it anymore. I'm sorry for everything, Sophie. I never meant for it to end like this. You'll never understand what he made me do." The note seemed like a confession, but it was far from clear. Was Lisa truly remorseful for her actions? Or was this another manipulation, another lie to cover up the truth? Harlow knew that in the world of abuse and manipulation, things were rarely as simple as they seemed. The note left more questions than answers, and it only intensified his suspicion that there was more to the story than Lisa's apparent suicide. The police quickly ruled Lisa's death as a suicide, but Detective Harlow wasn't convinced. The entire situation felt off to him. He had been through enough cases to recognize when something wasn't right. Lisa had been under constant surveillance since the footage was discovered, and there was no sign that she had been suicidal. Harlow began to wonder if perhaps Lisa hadn't taken her own life at all, What if Mark had silenced her to prevent the truth from coming out? To find answers, Harlow focused his attention on Lisa's past. He reviewed her phone records, her bank statements, and her communications in the days leading up to her death. It didn't take long before he uncovered something crucial. Lisa had been in touch with an old friend, a woman named Caroline, just days before her death. The two hadn't spoken in years, but their conversations had been frequent in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Caroline, who lived out of state, had received a disturbing call from Lisa the night before her death. Lisa had sounded frantic, begging for help and expressing fear for her life. According to Caroline, Lisa had planned to leave Mark and take Sophie with her, but she had no idea how to escape the situation. It became clear that Lisa had been trying to break free from the cycle of abuse, but something or someone had stopped her. Harlow's theory now seemed plausible. Mark had discovered Lisa's plan and had forced her into a corner, silencing her before she could expose the horrors of the Summers household. But why would she leave behind such a vague note? Why wouldn't she come forward and make a final statement, revealing everything? Detective Harlow decided to reach out to Caroline, hoping she could provide more information about Lisa's state of mind in the days leading up to her death. When they spoke, Caroline confirmed that Lisa had been planning to speak out, to reveal everything about the abuse. She had expressed guilt over Sophie's suffering but had never been able to find the strength to confront Mark. Caroline was sure that Lisa had intended to take Sophie and leave, but something had stopped her from going through with it. Whether it was Mark's threats or the fear of what would happen if she tried to escape, Lisa had never made it out. The new information fueled Harlow's belief that Mark was behind Lisa's death. His manipulation had gone further than anyone had realized. He had controlled both his wife and daughter for years, keeping them trapped in a cycle of fear and obedience. Lisa had been his willing accomplice, but deep down she had always known it was wrong. She had tried to escape, but in the end it seemed that Mark's control had extended even beyond death. With Lisa gone, Detective Harlow knew that Mark was the only one left who could answer the questions that had been plaguing the investigation. But with Lisa's suicide now casting a shadow over everything, the case had become even more complicated. Harlow was determined to bring Mark to justice, but he knew that the journey ahead would be far more treacherous than he had ever imagined. The twisted web of lies, manipulation, and fear that had ensnared the Summers family was far from over, and the truth was only just beginning to emerge. The investigation into Lisa's death only deepened the mystery surrounding the Summers family. Detective Harlow, now more certain than ever that Mark was responsible not only for the abuse, but also for Lisa's untimely death, shifted his focus to him. With Lisa gone, there were fewer obstacles standing between Harlow and the truth, but Mark was more dangerous than ever. He had spent years manipulating both his wife and daughter, and now, with Lisa silenced, there was no telling what lengths he would go to protect his secrets. Harlow knew that Mark was likely aware that the police were closing in on him. The hidden camera footage had already implicated him in Sophie's abuse, but Mark was a master manipulator, and Harlow had no doubt that he would do everything in his power to maintain his facade of innocence. Mark had always been the charming, affable father, someone who could convince anyone that he was just a regular guy trying to provide for his family. But behind the polished exterior was a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. The investigation turned into a waiting game. Harlow knew that he needed to get enough evidence to arrest Mark, but Mark was careful, covering his tracks at every turn. He had hired a lawyer, and despite his outwardly calm demeanor, he was becoming increasingly defensive. It became clear that Mark believed the storm would pass, that the lies he had carefully constructed for years would shield him from justice. But Harlow had seen enough to know that the truth would eventually come out. In the weeks following Lisa's death, the case took an unexpected turn. Sophie, who had been in protective custody, began to show signs of healing. She had been receiving therapy and slowly started to open up about her experiences. Her small voice, once silenced by fear, now carried the weight of the truth. Sophie spoke of the torment she had endured in the Summers home, recounting the violence, the emotional abuse, and the constant terror that had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. Her memories, though fragmented, were chilling, but they were the final pieces needed to complete the picture. It was Sophie's testimony, combined with the evidence from the hidden camera, that provided the catalyst for Mark's arrest. Detective Harlow knew that Sophie was still fragile, still haunted by the horrors she had witnessed and endured, but her courage in speaking out was a turning point. She had found the strength to expose her father for the monster he truly was. On the day of Mark's arrest, Harlow felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The case was far from over, but this was the moment they had all been waiting for. Mark Summers was taken into custody without resistance, his face blank, his eyes devoid of any remorse. The man who had terrorized his family for so long was finally being held accountable. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, Harlow knew that the damage had already been done. The scars Sophie carried would never fully heal. In the following months, Mark was tried for a multitude of crimes, including child abuse, neglect, and the murder of Lisa. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The footage from the hidden camera, combined with Sophie's testimony, painted a clear picture of a man who had used his family as pawns in a twisted game of control and domination. Lisa's death was ruled a homicide, with Mark being the primary suspect. It became clear that she had been pushed to the brink, unable to bear the weight of her actions any longer. She had tried to escape, but in the end Mark had crushed her spirit, just as he had done to Sophie. Mark was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison. But even as he was locked away, the damage he had done lingered. Sophie, now in the care of a loving foster family, faced the long road to recovery. She would carry the weight of her past with her, but with time she would heal. The nightmare was over, but the memories would remain, a constant reminder of the darkness that had once consumed her life. In the end, the case of the Summers family became one of the most chilling examples of abuse ever uncovered. The truth had come to light, but it came at a devastating cost. Sophie's courage in speaking out, along with the tireless work of Detective Harlow, ensured that Mark Summers would never hurt anyone again. But the scars of his actions would remain, a haunting reminder of the horrors that can lurk behind closed doors.